Welcome to the Book Reader channel.
Scott Belly wiped the sweat from his brow as he flipped another greasy basket of fries onto the tray. The diner was packed, and the smell of bacon and burgers filled the air, making his stomach growl. But he didn't have time to eat. The dinner rush wasn't slowing down, and neither could he. "Scott, Table 5's order is up," hollered his manager, a grumpy old man named Earl who always looked like he regretted hiring him. "Got it," Scott called back, grabbing the plates and weaving through the cramped diner to deliver the food. He smiled at the customers, but his mind was somewhere else, somewhere bigger. A food truck. His food truck. Mouthwatering Burgers. The name had been stuck in his head for months, playing on repeat every time he clocked into one of his two jobs. The dream felt so close he could almost taste it. Juicy patties, sizzling on a hot grill, customers lining up for a bite of something made with passion. But right now, all he had were 2 exhausting shifts, a growing savings account, and sore feet. After leaving the diner, Scott headed straight to his night shift at the warehouse. The work was brutal, hauling heavy boxes, loading trucks, and dodging forklifts in a place where no one cared if you were tired. His muscles ached, but every paycheck brought him closer to his dream. Months passed, and every dollar counted. He cut out all unnecessary spending. No new clothes, no nights out, just work, eat, and save. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Then, one Saturday morning, it finally happened. Scott stood in front of an old, rusted food truck sitting in the back lot of a mechanic shop. The paint was faded, the tires looked questionable, and the engine let out a wheezy cough when the mechanic turned the key. But to Scott, it was beautiful. "You sure about this, kid?" the mechanic asked, rubbing his chin. Scott grinned, running a hand over the dented metal. "Oh, I'm sure. This wasn't just a truck. It was his future." Scott leaned against the side of his newly acquired food truck, staring at the faded paint and the missing hubcap. It was a fixer-upper for sure, but so was he. The inside was worse: cracked countertops, rusted-out storage racks, and a fryer that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the 90s. But none of that mattered. It was his. He spent the next few weeks working nonstop. During the day, he scoured local farms and suppliers, determined to find something that would set his burgers apart. Everybody did greasy, heavy, slap some cheese on it burgers. He wanted something different, something that wouldn't just taste good, but feel good too. That's when he found them. Grass-fed, wheat-gluten-free patties. The kind of burger that wasn't just for the average fast food lover, but for the folks looking for something fresh, something healthy. It was risky. This was Mississippi, after all, where deep fried was king. But Scott had a gut feeling. He scraped together what little savings he had left after buying the truck and purchased the first batch of meat. Then, he picked up a few essentials, not just for the business, but for himself. A sleeping bag, a small portable heater, a few pots and pans. Because after everything he had lost, his apartment, his savings from past failed ventures, this truck wasn't just his business. It was his home now, too. Nights were rough. The metal walls of the truck barely held in heat, and the winter chill crept through every crack and crevice. He'd wake up stiff, fingers numb, but he'd remind himself why he was doing this. Every morning, he'd roll up his sleeping bag, wipe down the counters, and get to work. He wasn't just trying to make ends meet. He was trying to build something. Finally, after weeks of fixing up the truck, patching leaks, deep cleaning the grill, and repainting the outside, Mouthwatering Burgers was almost ready to roll. The final touch. A sign. Bold red letters with crisp white trim, stretching across the top of the truck. Mouthwatering Burgers. Where every bite is mouthwatering. Scott stepped back, hands on his hips, staring up at his work. For the first time in a long time, he felt it. Hope. All he needed now was a first customer. Scott sat inside his truck, flipping through a notepad filled with ideas. He had been parked at the ball fields and the local track for weeks now, hoping parents and athletes would stop by for a quick bite. Some did, but not enough. The numbers weren't adding up. The money he made on weekends barely covered supplies, let alone helped him get ahead. He wasn't ready to give up, but something had to change. One evening, after another slow day, an older man with a thick beard and a hard hat stopped by. He ordered a burger, took one bite, and let out a satisfied grunt. "Damn, son, this is good," the man said, wiping his mouth. "You ever thought about bringing this truck to a construction site?" Scott raised an eyebrow. "Construction site? Yeah, man. We work long hours, we eat big, and most importantly," the man grinned, tapping his pocket, "we always got cash." Scott didn't hear anything after that, just the sound of cash registers ringing in his mind. The next morning, Scott fired up his truck and drove to the construction site the man mentioned. It wasn't flashy, just a dirt lot filled with heavy machinery, dust clouds, and men in neon vests wiping sweat from their brows. He parked near the entrance and flipped the open sign. At first, a few workers came by, intrigued by the new food truck. But Scott noticed something quickly. Most of them hesitated when they saw his menu. "Y'all ain't got beef?" one guy asked. Scott shook his head. "Nah, I got grass-fed, wheat-gluten-free burgers. Healthy, real good flavor." The man scratched his chin, unimpressed. "I dunno, man. I need something that sticks to my ribs." That same conversation happened a few more times that day. Scott made some sales, but he knew he was leaving money on the table. If he wanted Mouthwatering Burgers to thrive, he needed to give the people what they wanted. That night, he went back to researching. He tried different beef and pork blends, messing with seasonings, grilling temperatures, and toppings. It took some trial and error, but after a week, he finally had it: 3 burger options. The classic beef, juicy, seasoned to perfection. The pork belly special, a pork burger with smoky, rich flavors. The original grass-fed, his healthier signature option. With his new menu in place, Scott returned to the construction site. This time, when workers asked for beef or pork, he had an answer. And the result? They lined up. Word spread fast, and soon, workers from other sites started swinging by. Some days, Scott barely had time to catch his breath between orders. The grill stayed hot, the cash kept flowing, and for the first time since starting Mouthwatering Burgers, Scott felt like he was winning. Business was booming. But success came with new challenges: keeping up with demand, managing supplies, and figuring out how to take Mouthwatering Burgers to the next level. And Scott, he was just getting started. But beneath the sizzle of the grill and the rush of customers handing him cash, Scott was hiding a dark secret. The truth was, his booming business was built on borrowed time. His gambling debts weren't just bad, they were dangerous. The kind of debt where the people he owed weren't content with late payments. They wanted their money, and they wanted it now. Scott had tried to make the food truck work the honest way, but the cost of fresh ingredients was bleeding him dry. Profits weren't enough to cover the money he owed, and the more customers he got, the more supplies he needed. Then came the breaking point. One night, after closing up the truck, Scott sat in the driver's seat, counting what little cash he had left after buying ingredients. His fingers trembled. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. That was when he saw him. A drifter, some guy slumped against the side of an abandoned building, lost in his own world. No one around. No witnesses. Scott had always told himself he wasn't a bad person. He just made bad bets. But that night, his desperation spoke louder than his conscience. It was easier than he thought. A quick, calculated move. No hesitation. No time for guilt. He did what had to be done. And when he looked down at the lifeless body in front of him, an idea crept into his mind. A sick, twisted solution to his biggest problem. Meat was expensive. But this was free. He told himself it was just one time, just to get through the next week. He mixed the new ingredient with the pork, stretching the supply, making it last longer. He seasoned it well, grilled it to perfection, and waited to see if anyone noticed. They didn't. In fact, the customers loved it. The workers at the construction site kept coming back, raving about the rich flavor, the tenderness. Some even said it was the best burger they'd ever had. Scott smiled, handed them their food, and took their cash. And with every bite they took, his secret stayed buried. But the problem with getting away with something once? It made it easier to do it again. Now, Scott wasn't just running a food truck. He was running a business built on blood. And the hunger for success was turning him into something far worse than just a man in debt. The days that followed were a blur. Scott's food truck became busier than ever. The lines of customers seemed endless, especially at the construction site. They came for the burgers, but they stayed for the taste, the flavor that no one could quite identify but couldn't get enough of. He was making money, hand over fist. But beneath the success, the pressure was building. Every time Scott handed over a tray of burgers, he had to remind himself, just keep it together. You're feeding them what they want. Nothing's wrong. But it wasn't that simple. The guilt was there, lurking beneath the surface, a constant whisper in the back of his mind. Every time someone took a bite, it felt like the weight of his secret was getting heavier. It had only been a few days since Head made the decision to cross the line, but already the unease was starting to catch up with him. One night, after a particularly grueling shift, Scott was cleaning up the truck when he noticed something, a small trail of blood near the door. His stomach sank. He knew immediately what had happened. He hadn't cleaned up well enough. The knife Head used to cut up the body, the one he had shoved in a hidden compartment beneath the counter, he must be dropped it. The bloodstains weren't noticeable during the day, but in the dim light of the evening, it was unmistakable. Scott's heart raced. His mind spun with a dozen possible ways to cover it up. He grabbed the cloth and scrubbed furiously, wiping down every inch of the truck. There was no room for mistakes. If anyone found out. Hey, Scott. His heart leaped into his throat. He turned to see a man, one of the regulars from the construction site, walking up to the truck, his hands on his hips. Smells good in here. You're cleaning up already? Scott wiped the sweat from his brow, forcing a smile. Yeah, long day. Just making sure everything's in order. The man eyed him for a moment, then shrugged. Yeah, looks like you're keeping it tight. But man, I gotta ask. He paused, as if unsure whether to speak his mind. What's up? Scott replied, his voice a little too sharp. I don't know. Something's been bugging me. The burgers, they taste different, Not that it's bad. Hell, it's damn good. Just different. Scott's stomach dropped. His breath caught in his chest. He knew that tone. He wasn't sure if it was suspicion or just a random thought. Oh, it's a new seasoning blend I've been testing. Helps the flavor pop. Scott forced the words out, his voice thick with tension. I guess you're just not used to it. It's all in the seasoning, man. The man seemed satisfied with that explanation and clapped Scott on the back. All right, man. Keep it up. You got something special here. Scott nodded, watching him walk away, every muscle in his body tight with fear. As the man disappeared into the night, Scott leaned against the counter, his hands shaking. Just keep it together, he muttered to himself, but the cracks were starting to show. The next few days were a blur of panic and decision-making. Scott knew he was walking a tightrope, but now someone else was holding the strings. Every order he filled felt like another step closer to the edge. Scott was up to 14 bodies and counting. And it was only a matter of time before someone, maybe the cops, maybe one of his customers, put it all together. One evening, just as Scott was about to close up shop, a police car rolled into the parking lot. The officer got out and walked toward the truck, his face set in that all too familiar, no-nonsense expression. Scott's heart leaped into his throat. You the owner of Mouthwatering Burgers? The officer asked. Scott nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, officer. What's the problem? We've had a few complaints that there might be more to this food truck. The officer said, glancing around the area. There was a young lady named Lucy. She has been missing for a few days. Her mother said that she was coming to get one of your mouthwater burgers, but have not been seen since. I just want to come and check the area, if that's okay. Scott's mind raced, his blood running cold. This was it. He couldn't let them see the inside of the truck. He couldn't let them find out the truth. He had to make a choice. Fight to keep everything Head built, or face the consequences of the darkness Head created. The door of the food truck slammed shut as the officer stepped inside, his eyes scanning the cramped interior. Scott's heart pounded in his chest, his palms clammy. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of his secret pressing on him with every passing second. I'm just doing my job, the officer said, his voice stern. We've had reports of missing people around here. I'm sure you understand why we're concerned. Scott swallowed hard. He had no escape. His heart raced, and for the first time since Head started Mouthwatering Burgers, he didn't have a clever answer. "You got a search warrant?" Scott asked, his voice trembling. The officer looked him dead in the eyes. "No need for one." "You've already given me permission, haven't you? Step aside." Scott stood frozen, unable to move. He watched as the officer began searching the truck, pulling open drawers, rifling through cabinets. And then the officer found it, the hidden compartment beneath the counter where Scott had stored the evidence of his darkest secret. "You're under arrest for murder," the officer said, pulling out a bag filled with blood-stained clothing. "You've been serving human remains in your burgers. You're a monster." Scott's world crashed around him. He was no longer in control. The food truck, the dream Head fought for, the one thing that had kept him going, was now his prison. The courtroom was packed, a sense of tension hanging in the air. News outlets had caught wind of Scott's arrest, and the small-town courtroom was filled with reporters, curious spectators, and the families of the victims he had hidden behind his delicious facade. Scott sat in the defendant's chair, his face pale, his hands bound with cuffs. He had been through weeks of hearings, but nothing could prepare him for this moment. The weight of his crimes hung over him like a dark cloud. The prosecutor stood, presenting evidence after evidence, photos of the victims, the remains found in his food truck, the testimonies from witnesses who had seen Scott's victims in the days leading up to their disappearances. The defense attorney, who had once seemed so hopeful about getting Scott a lighter sentence, was now silent. There was no way to spin this. There was no way out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge stood to deliver the verdict. "Scott Belly," the judge said, his voice heavy with finality, "you stand here today for the horrific crimes you've committed: murder, mutilation, and selling human remains as food to innocent customers. There is no excuse for the depravity you've shown. You have shown no remorse, and your actions have devastated families, a community, and countless lives." Scott's heart raced, his throat tight as he struggled to breathe. The judge continued, "The jury has found you guilty of all charges. And for these crimes, you are hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection." Scott felt the floor beneath him shift as if the very foundation of his life was crumbling. He was a young man with big dreams once, dreams that had turned into nightmares. "May God have mercy on your soul," the judge said, slamming his gavel down. The news spread like wildfire through the town. Mouth-watering burgers became infamous, a symbol of greed, desperation, and horror. Scott Belly's name would forever be tied to the twisted crimes he committed under the guise of a successful food truck owner. As Scott was led from the courtroom, shackled and broken, he glanced one last time at the window. Outside, the sun was setting, just like his dream, fading into the darkness. And as the cell door slammed shut behind him, he realized the cruelest twist of all. He had achieved his dream, but at the cost of his soul.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. I'll be back with the next episode of the series every Wednesday, so mark your calendars and stay tuned. Catch you next time.